The book Slow Wood, it's about building our house, which I'll tell you about because it's got pretty pictures and all. But the book has an argument, and I'm going to tell you the argument at the outset, and then we'll circle around to it. And basically, the argument is that we, in this country or in New England, and particularly in rural areas, ought to be cutting more wood than we are from our forests and using it as locally and directly as possible. That's the basic premise, which we can do in rural areas. But that if we do that, we need to deliberately as we can, tie that back to what we'll call ecological forestry. We'll talk about that. The book's written for a general audience. It's from Yale Press, but it's a trade book, and it's aimed squarely at environmentalists, at tree huggers and forest bathers, and people like me who love forests. And forests are great things, but the basic question is, where does our wood come from? We have a large industrial society. We need a lot of wood, but what's the best way to get it? What can we do about that? And so the premise is that we should connect beautiful houses to beautiful forests, basically. And the book uses, the narrative thread is building this house on our farm, and I'll tell you about that, from the woodlot on our farm. And it's got, I'm an historian, so it's got some historical parts to it about how Americans have built wood, European Americans mainly, and how that's changed over time as our economy industrialized in the 19th century and began extracting resources on a national scale. The connection between our house building and local forests was broken. So, okay. So I will march through these, and yeah, just go ahead and ask questions. So today, New England's 80% forested. The colors in that map, many of you will know immediately what they are. Everything that isn't white is forest. And the red stuff is corporate ownership. And the blue is public ownership, like Exeter State Park, and the whites and the Green Mountain Forest and all the state forests down in Massachusetts. And all the light green is what foresters call family-owned forests, smaller private parcels, which is 40% of the New England forest. And the other green color are some nonprofits, and the tan color is a scandalously small non-tribal land, tribal forest. So we're 80% forested in New England.
What was the brown? I missed that.
Tribal.
Okay, that was tan, but brown.
Brown?
Industry.
The reddish.
Paper companies.
Oh, that's this stuff. Yeah, it's investment. It's real estate investment trusts and TMOs. What are those again?
Timber Investment Management Organization.
So large Wall Street private equity investment in forest land that's industrial forest and is cut quite heavily.
They're doing that with
And produces, what's that?
They're doing that with agriculture. Gates and others are buying up large tracts of agriculture.
Well, this is nothing new, but yeah.
Sure.
This is a continuation of 19th century large-scale pulp cutting that's just gone into even larger ownerships.
Phenomenal amount in Maine.
Yeah, it's 10 million acres in Maine. It's 10 million acres in Maine, which is half of Maine. And it's 12 million acres in New England, so it's a quarter of New England. Our forest is 40% industrial, 40% family forest, and 20%. And we'll talk about that. But, so we do have a forest industry. We got a boatload of forests, and we cut half of our lumber. Half of the lumber that we consume is produced in New England. That's just a net balance calculation. We cut a little more pulp, so of all different kinds of wood we consume, it's more like about 3/4. And we'll talk about that a bunch more. Even the southern New England states, like where I live right there, are 60% forested. And they're the most, except for New Jersey, they are the second, third, and fourth most densely populated states in the country. And they're 60% forested, and they cut nothing. They cut like 5% of the wood they consume. And you wouldn't expect them to cut all the wood they consume. They don't have enough forest. But they're cutting nowhere near what they could.
And Brian, it's begging the question, but does it come from Canada?
Yes. So the wood that's in that balance calculation. It's really, there's no data really on wood flows, but so we just added up data on how much we totally produce in each state, and we figured out how much we totally consume and compared them. So, we may be exporting stuff and then importing other, but yes, we get forests, we get wood products. Well, it's complicated. We ship a lot of our wood to be milled in Canada, but we get stuff from the boreal forests of Quebec, which is being heavily cut, and we get most of American wood production is now in the southeast, from Virginia to Texas. That's over half of our lumber production and 3/4 of our pulp production is from there. So it's coming from there. It's just coming from the world market.
Is that predominantly southern pine?
Yes, it's loblolly and slash pine on very, very short rotations, mostly in plantations. So, there's another map of the forests of New England. What that's showing is above ground carbon density, and the really reddish ones are a lot of carbon density, and this blue is very little above ground density, and that's for two reasons. One is that this forest type, spruce fir, doesn't have quite as much above ground mass as a deciduous forest that's more predominant in northern hardwoods than oak down here, but it's also because this is cut very heavily on short rotations. These trees never live to be more than 50 years old, and this is hardly cut at all. So we pride ourselves on that to some extent. We're like, wow, we got this forest, it's sequestering carbon, it's storing carbon, it's great for the climate and all that, but it's a shell game. The wood is coming from someplace else. It's being cut someplace else, and the atmosphere doesn't care. So we call that the illusion of preservation. So the argument again of the book is that we ought to be cutting more wood and cutting it better here, closer to home. So I illustrate this through the story of this house we built on our farm. So it comes all the fun part. That is our farm. Yale, Massachusetts, 170 acres, 50 acres of grass. We raise beef cattle and pigs and squash and pumpkins, and about 100 acres of timber. It's very typical for a New England farm.
Where in Yale is it?
Where in Yale? It's on the west side, right over by the Fall River, almost in Greenfield. And it's protected by the state by an agricultural preservation restriction, so it can't be developed. We co-own it with friends. And they live in this old white farmhouse, and we actually own the barn. Our LLC that we co-own rents the barn back from them. But basically, we bought it, the state protected it, they bought the existing farmhouse, Faith and I, my wife and I bought it, and our family bought a 2-acre lot. And we built that house from that woods.
Yeah.
That's an open pine-dominated woods, as you can see, and so we'll talk about that.
So that's a local mill that you have on site?
Yeah, you'll see. We use several different mills. Yeah. Say something else. Oh, what I wanted to say is this is what I'm going to show you about. Well, we went out and built our house with a local mill and all that. It's not that unusual. I know a lot of people. There's I can name half a dozen people in this town who have done similar kinds of things. It's not that outlandish. And my argument is that the large majority of the building we do in rural areas ought to be done in some similar way. There's a wide variety of ways that I can go at it. So that's the woodlot up on the top part of the hill. It's about 100 years old, which I know from counting rings on the trees that were cut, and it had not been managed in all that time, which means that it was full of trees. Still pretty crowded, and a lot of the trees were crooked and crowding each other and so forth, which is ecologically fine. That's just what forests do as they mature, and eventually more and more the trees get squeezed out as time goes by. From a silvicultural point of view, of wanting to grow quality timber, what you do is you cut the worst first. You go in and do a low-grade harvest. Instead of cutting the highest value trees, you take out everything that has less value. So you're kind of making your own version of the sorts of selection that nature would do, but you're aimed at tipping the balance toward the really nice straight pines and oaks and so forth that have a lot of value for timber. Not going too overboard. You're trying to be very diverse. That's what it looked like after we thinned it. After we did a low-grade harvest, after we bought the property, as we were thinking about building our house, we took out 300 cords of firewood and 100-something thousand board feet of timber, oak and pine, but a lot of other stuff, which I'll tell you about. That's a red oak that we left, and that's a black birch they got left, and a couple other red oaks. So that's what it looks like after, removing, I don't know, a third or something of the basal area.
What are the primary uses for the low grade? You said firewood?
Normally it would be firewood would be the big one. Up here it might be pulp. In southern New England it isn't because you're not close enough to the pulp mills to bear the cost of trucking. So finding low grade markets is actually a big problem for doing good forestry, because you want to at least have it pay its way out of the wood. But mostly it goes for fire. But in our case, we were building a house. Now that's a low grade tree that I love, that's hemlock. And hemlock is a tree that I've got a long connection to. It's a real important tree ecologically along the streams, suffering from the invasion of hemlock woolly adelgid, but there's places where I have fought to protect hemlock trees, and I never really thought about it as a timber tree. It is a timber tree, but it's one of very low value compared to pine. Hemlock's worth about $25 a thousand on the stump, and pine is worth $100 to $150 on the stump. That's the difference.
What's wrong with hemlock?
What's wrong with hemlock? Exactly. Great question. There's nothing wrong with hemlock. It's stronger than pine, it's prettier than pine, it's not worth anything because it does not yield a lot of high-grade boards off the outside of the log because it's very shade tolerant and holds its branches so it's full of knots. So you're not going to get nice clear lumber out of it. Plus it's got some susceptibility to something called ring shake, where the end of the rings disappear, separate. So basically,
What causes the shake?
no one knows exactly. But luckily we didn't have much. Yeah. I don't know.
We have friends in Dummerston that did a timber frame out of hemlock.
Yeah. So this is what we think, and we were like, oh, I mean,
Yeah,
look
for
at
exactly that reason, that big beams,
big beams.
it makes it, all that stuff is an issue.
Yeah, it is an issue, and actually it's not that big an issue for some of the stuff off the outside as well, if you see. It's just not worth anything. We're like, oh, sell the pine, build with the hemlock, so that's what we did.
Most of the timber frame, older structures were hemlock when it was available.
Yeah,
More so than-
exactly.
Because who cares about the
They-
knots? Maybe that's preferred.
Exactly. They used exactly what was available wherever they were, a wide variety of things, and, and figure out what size you gotta make it so it'll be strong enough, and hemlock's a little stronger than pine.
Rot resistant too.
What's that?
Hemlock's a little more rot resistant.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter inside the house,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure. It's a shade more. So I'm just gonna take you through the process. That's our logger's name, Ed Klaus. That's his cable skidder. We put the kids in for a little extra traction there.
Loaded tires.
Yeah, loaded tires. You guys have all seen this. That's one of Ed's landings. You got hardwood logs on the left and firewood on the right. If you get a big load of pine logs back about where I was standing, taking the picture. Those are the hemlock logs with the kids standing on them. Those are going to become the posts. All these things that Molly and I have ever written about agriculture, like the New England Food Vision, always have pictures of kids in the garden with the tomatoes. When do you see pictures of kids logging? So I put kids in every picture and stand there. So yeah, that's Ed logging, guarding up the log about this time of year. This was in 2011. And we got a band mill. It's a man named Michael Ewing sawing out some of the joists and there on the property. And as we were saying, what you do when you saw a hemlock or a log for a beam is that you saw stuff off the outside. So you saw a slab, you saw off 1-bys, some of the top logs. In some cases, you cut 2-bys, and you end up with maybe an 8x8 center box. It's very strong. So in the middle, and in this case, he sliced them in half to get 4x8 joists. You see there.
Wow.
And so Michael, so we got a timber framer, and our partner owning the farm, Tom, is an architect and carpenter, so he designed the thing, and the timber framer, added the vernacular knowledge of how many braces to put in the vents and all that. So that's over at the tip.
Nice.
Dave Bowman's place. Dave's a great timber framer, and you see I brought over a trailer load of the rough cut beams and stuff, and that's a plate That's the bottom side. One of the top plates, you can see the mortises that have been cut for the post tenon and for the brace tenon there.
How'd you plane such a large piece of wood?
Yeah, so the timber framers have big power planers.
Those big maquitas?
What's that? Yeah. Cool. They use a combination of power and hand tools to do different parts of the stuff. I didn't do any of that work. I did help make some of the pegs.
Is there a margin of how much that beam will move?
It moves a lot. The whole thing is done green, and so the frame goes up and it's kind of locked in place, and while they're putting on the roof and the sheathing and everything, it's in there. And for another year, in the middle of the night, you hear a bang, and this check will show up in the beam. So if that stuff bothers you, you do not want to build this way. But it gets stable enough by the time they're doing the finished work, so that not a lot of huge cracks appear. And there's tricks. I mean, you fur out we surrounded the frame with SIPS panels, structurally insulated panels. But you can fur out the outside of the post so that there's a little room behind the post to slip the drywall.
Yeah.
For example. So there we are, pegging the thing together. Those are those pegs. We're putting together the vents there on the deck. It's a job for a kid to build a house. And got a bunch of friends together, small crane, raised it in a day. So you raise up the vents, which are, the longitudinal sections. And then add the floor joists and then the top plates, and all kinds of interesting things happen that I won't go into. But to make a halfway decent story, not a lot went wrong building this house, which makes for a really boring book. But I threw in every minor mishap I could. So that's the next morning. We did not do we did a conventional roof, because that part of the joinery is slow and expensive. And we weren't going to have like a beautiful ceiling where we could stare up at our beautiful rafters and purlins. So we just used regular 2x10s or whatever on 16-foot spacing to do the roof. But I ran around the next day taking all these pictures of the frame because you only get to see it for a few days. So there it is over a pile of 1x. There it is over the pasture gate. That's the wood it came from behind it. Hemlocks are up there. So all those 2x that we cut in the process, we sent them away, got them kilned, and the mill worker milled them tongue and groove for us, and we used them for subflooring. We surrounded the house, as I said, with structural insulated panels, two layers of chipboard with foam inside. If we were doing it today, I would look into getting the same effect with wood fiber insulation, which is a new product coming out of Maine now.
Timber fiber HP, right?
Yep, exactly so. Instead of using that foam. But the beauty of the SIPS panels is they make a very tight house, well insulated, and they sit outside the frame, so the frame is exposed and becomes this major ornamental feature of the house. So we use those guys, those hemlock 2x for subflooring. You can sort of see them looking up there. But we use conventional lumber, the carpenters did, for all the interior walls, because they were just going to, we could have done it out of our own local stuff, but it was just a lot easier, and we didn't really see the point of using local stuff for that, because it was just going to vanish behind the drywall. But you could if you wanted. The point is there are a lot of different ways you can do this kind of thing. You can make your own calls on what feels good. And the 1x that came off the outside, I used to make board and batten doors, which is something I could do. That's about the limits of my skills. That's Maggie's bedroom door that I'm boiling up there. But the hemlock makes really pretty doors. That Colonial Hardware has an interesting story behind it. Ask me about it later. It is so genuine you could never believe it. Not that I had intended to use Colonial Hardware, but it appeared at the right moment. So then Dave says, we need something, this is a little earlier obviously, in the process, we need something nice and dark and curved for braces. So we ran around the farm, we found some crooked black cherry. In our part of the world, most black cherry is in old pastures and stuff, and it's really crooked. So I cut those. I felled those little guys, and Ed came down and skidded them out to the edge of the pasture, and And we cut out all the curved pieces already, and then went over to Dave's shop so he could cut them up for braces. So that's the straight pieces that were left, and those ended up, had those sawed and got porch posts out of them, because cherry's quite not resistant. We got a lot of really nice, beautiful cherry one-bys to use in different parts of the house. So the point being that you can use different parts of different trees for different things you need in the house, and they kind of generate themselves along the way as you're making the frame. So that's Dave Bowman, and he's got that curved slab of cherry on his band mill, and he's just sawing it straight through to get slabs look like that, 3-inch slabs. And he's going to pull curved braces out of those, rough them out with a chainsaw, and they'll be book matched because they'll be reflected in opposite directions on the different faces, and those are the braces. Oh my goodness! Some of them had that curly grain because that's just expressing the curve in the tree and the stresses. Mm-hmm. And the straight ones underneath are just hemlock braces.
Structurally, how much more robust is that compared to just if you were to cut the curve in a straight grain?
None. It's purely aesthetic.
Oh,
the straight
okay.
ones would be just as good. They just give you a lateral rigidity, and if you're going to have a curved one, the grain better curve, or you'll be making it weaker. But no, that's purely ornamental.
Okay.
Yeah, the straight ones are just as good for a knee brace.
So it's aesthetic.
It's aesthetic. But the point here is that the structural and the aesthetic are pretty much the same thing in a timber frame house. Or can be.
Like making
You
an
don't-
arched bridge instead of a
What's
flat
that?
bridge. I said for me it was like making an arched bridge instead of a flat bridge.
Yeah, but this
Same
is,
purpose,
that's
but-
very true, but the curve isn't doing that kind of structural work in a house. It's not helping hold the thing up. All the brace is doing is adding lateral
Yeah.
rigidity. None of the load is going down through the braces. It's a sideways thing. But all that extra cherry went into so you can see a couple of the curved braces in the house there, went into the risers on the stairs. The treads are sugar maple, the newel posts, the stringers are cherry, the floor banding there by the hearth, windowsills. Now, another low-grade species that we use a lot is black birch, which don't have much up here. You've got yellow birch, which is very similar in lumber. Black birch is an early successional tree in oak forests and moving into northern hardwoods a little bit. It lives to be 80 or 100 years. Well, it'll live longer, but typically once it gets to be 80 or 100 years old, it stops growing and the oaks will overtop it. So at this point, most of the black birch in our stand, or a lot of it, came out. It's kind of another low-grade thing. And again, it doesn't have a lot of value on the timber market, but it's a beautiful wood. Very heavy and strong. It's as heavy as oak, just about. And it's almost as hard as sugar maple. So we had it milled up by a guy named David Lashway. The man on the left is our farm partner, Tom, the architect. So we had it milled for flooring, basically. We cut a lot more than we needed, so we had it all kilned and milled up and sold most of it to a woods cooperative and just kept some of it. So that's black birch is in the floor, the finished floor, and the cabinets. Got a cabinet maker to use some. Again, some of that had some really nice curly grain in it, and all the trim in the house, and the baseboards, that kind of stuff is black birch. So again, a low-grade species that was kind of its time to come out of our woods, so that's what we use. So that's sort of what the house looks like. It's 2,400 square foot house, below average for new houses in this country today. Got a masonry heater in it, which we keep fed pretty much by what falls on our fence. We got 2 miles of high tensile fence, so that generates a lot of firewood, as you all know.
Wait, no, I don't understand that.
You put a fence up between your pasture and the woods,
Yeah.
and all the trees are trying to get into the wood, into the pasture. That's their job in life, is essentially to take.
They fall.
And they fall, because all their weight is. So if you build a fence, it automatically generates tons and tons of wood that falls on it. Believe me, trust me on this.
No.
Yeah.
So, and can you say a little bit about your wood, the stone there?
Yeah, so this local stone, it was made by a local mason, as part of the Masonry Heaters Guild. It's a masonry stove, so it's got several tons of thermal mass. It's got a a core of Firebrook with all the secondary combustion chambers and convoluted flues and all that stuff, so it gets so you build 1 or 2 fires a day that burn in about 2 hours at fantastically hot and get complete combustion, and the thermal mass takes all the heat and then re-radiates it at about 100, 110 degrees for the next 12 to 24 hours, so you just sit on the bench or you sit on the stove. It's a wonderful way to heat. It's efficient and very, very comfortable. We burn about 4 or 5 quarts a winter, and it's got that pizza oven. You know, on a good night, I've cooked pizza in that thing in 90 seconds.
Do you have
That was too hot.
Do you have a backup system, or is it just wood?
We did, sure.
You got a fan that's kind of moving that?
No, it's radiant. So anything it sees, it will heat. Anything that's less than 110 degrees is going to be pushed in that direction by
So
that.
it's convection kind of.
It's not convection, it's radiation. That thing is sending out infrared radiation heat into any other surface that's cooler than it, such as you or any of the walls, and the walls become secondary radiators. And it's got a nice tight thermal, package around the outside, and it heats very, very well. We hardly ever, now that we live there full time, last winter, I just forced the backup propane baseboard heat to come on once to make sure it was working. And it heats the water too. Yeah. So, yeah, that is the house portion of the talk. And we can ask more questions and talk about it a little more, but now I want to make the link to ecological forestry a little stronger and go back to the argument, if that's okay. Everyone? So the idea behind ecological forestry is basically that we got to get wood for all these wonderful uses. As an industrial society, we need a lot of it. It's a great material compared to concrete and steel, but we don't want to ravage the world's forests in getting it, which is what is currently happening. Most of the world's supply of wood comes from plantations, a lot of them in the global south. Old growth forests are still being cut down around the world to supply wood, as soybeans and palm plantations and things like that continue to expand at their expense, or again, the boreal forest in Canada. There's a lot of plantation production in this country as well, which is efficient, but gives you very few other ecological benefits at the same time that the wood is being grown. So the argument of ecological forestry is, can we manage in ways that are a good bit more restrained, still get wood, as we've just been seeing, and keep a forest that very much resembles the kind of forest that would have been grown there otherwise. Won't be exactly the same because we are harvesting from it. So in that case, this is part of our woodlot where we've done the thinning, and there's still quite a bit of black birch actually left in that area. So as the forest is growing up, as it's young, every decade or two you go in and you thin it out, mimicking the process of what happens naturally as the stand matures. And then, when it gets older, you start to think about how you're going to regenerate it. When it's well over a century old, maybe 120, 140 years old, depending on the circumstances and what you want, you're going to start making some kinds of gaps. Because that's what would happen with a natural forest, and depending on what sorts of disturbances occurred to it. In northern hardwoods, it would typically be ice storms, or very small, downdraft microburst type of storms that would give you a diversified age structure over very long periods of time. Down towards the coast in southern New England, where there are more hurricanes, you might get larger kinds of openings that would put in enough light for white pine and oak and so forth to thrive. So you're going to try to do things in the way you harvest that mimic that and give you some of the species that you want, but you're also going to go with what nature seems to be trying to do at the moment and keep it nice and diverse. This is a ringer of a photo. This is not from New England. This is from northwestern Pennsylvania. An organization called the Foundation for Sustainable Forests does this kind of forestry there, and they create small gaps when they want to regenerate. So you'll have tulip poplar in there coming in, They've left some structure, some of those dead trees. That's about a 2-acre gap they made in a place where there wasn't a lot of good mature trees that they wanted to keep growing, and then you expand around the edges of these gaps periodically over the next several decades and regenerate forests in that way. And that man is named Steve Latta, and he's at the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, and Steve has been doing studies of early successional bird species in these small gaps, because the issue is, will early successional birds use nice small gaps? Do they need some huge gap? And it turns out, as it should not be a surprise, they do use small gaps, because that's what they've been adapted to for thousands of years. And as a matter of fact, interior nesting species, after they've nested, like these small gaps too, and spend time, the fledglings spend time in these things before they migrate. They move into the gaps, because he's doing nesting netting and all that kind of stuff. That is a white pine stand on our property that was actually, that's called a seed tree cut. It was done just before we bought the place in 2005. And in that case, you let in a lot of light to try to get white pine regeneration, which they did. And we later harvested that overstory of pine. So that's kind of the larger gap. About 20 acres when that stuff came down. But by now, the regen is like, whatever, 30 years old, 20 years old, and nice and tall, and there's a ton of black birching along the pine. I could talk about that some more. There's all kinds of interesting iterations about which kind of trees regenerate where. For instance, we've been trying to get oak regeneration in our oak stand and totally failing. But we got oak regeneration under the pines. The blue jays and squirrels had hidden acorns in there, and the pines and black birch being so thick that the deer couldn't find all the oaks. So there's actually some nice little oaks in there now too. Okay, so this is some analysis that I already referred to that I did with Tony D'Amato over at UVM, and his postdoc, Caitlin Littlefield, was the lead author, and Dave Foster, and a bunch of us did that analysis of all the wood production and consumption in the New England states to make the point that, as I was saying at the outset, we're not producing as much wood as we consume. And that shows that production on the left and consumption on the right. And you can see that most of New England's wood production is coming out of Maine, about 70% of our production, and that the southern New England states on the right are most of the consumption, all as you would expect, but just that tiny amount of production we see in southern New England. So what we said in Beyond the Illusion was what we ought to do about this is, first of all, protect all the forests we have. Second, reduce consumption of wood. And third, expand ecological forestry to at least balance the books. On protecting forest land, we used the framing of wildlands and woodlands that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and I have a few copies of that here. But since 2005, out of Harvard Forest and then with scholars around New England, we've been advocating for large-scale continuing forest protection. 70% of New England's protected in forest ultimately within several decades, and setting at least 10% of that, at least 10% of New England as wild reserves that are never managed, and could be more. But then the rest of it managed in a wide variety of sustainable forestries, such as I was just talking about. So that's the forest protection framework. And as far as reducing consumption, I could go on about this, but Americans have been reducing paper consumption for the past couple decades as newsprint disappears and this kind of stuff. Actually, I think when we first got computers, we were printing everything, but now we're really not. So there's not as much of this. There's more packaging, but it hasn't, because of Amazon and so forth, but it hasn't made up for the other declines. So our paper consumption has been going down, and for this study, we projected we could keep driving it down, and we could do a little bit better job recycling. That would reduce our demand. And on the lumber side, that's interesting. We need more affordable housing. We need more housing, clearly. And wood's a good material to build it out of, so that, and wood is a good replacement for some concrete and steel construction. With mass timber, you can do kind of the analog of timber framing that we do at our place, and that's much more environmentally friendly than steel and concrete because the amount of energy and mining that go into steel and concrete. And you can build between 6 and 12 stories with cross-laminated timber and glulam beams very nicely. That's a fast charging technology that looks very good, but the issue is what kind of forestry provides the wood. But in any case, even if we were to build more of that kind of housing, multi-family housing in urban and suburban areas with wood, that would take some more wood to do, but it would also be replacing single-family housing at the same time, and the units are smaller. So we kind of did the calculations and we're convinced that we can meet our housing needs. And the state of Massachusetts has actually also calculated this, the housing needs for the state as part of their climate plan, their 2050 climate plan. So we use some of their numbers, and the bottom line is we can do more wood construction where we need to and still reduce overall timber consumption. Doesn't say that we will, but we very reasonably could. So our projection for 2060 has lower consumption and has actually less production to meet it. But what happens with the production is the blue is pulp and the tan color here is sawlog. And what you're doing by ecological long rotation forestry is shifting more of your wood production into timber and producing less pulp. So you're trying to get rid of the real short rotation cutting such as done in the industrial forest that's focusing on pulp and move that towards timber production.
And what do you use as long rotation? Would that be 80 years?
No, more than that.
100 years?
Yeah, more than that. Yeah, it's going to vary from stand to stand, but really we're talking in the kinds of forests we have in New England, especially in my part of it. I'm not really sure about the spruce fir forest, but in northern hardwoods and in oak and white pine, our part of the world, I'd say 120 to 140 years on that range. So they're not old growth, although you can do kinds of forestry that move you toward old growth structure. But basically our way of thinking about it is set 10% or more of the forest aside, let that become your old growth, and manage the forest you're managing on long rotation so you've got a lot of mature forest and you're growing high quality trees. And you're getting your low grade material by thinning on the way towards your high quality timber, sort of as we do. Yeah. That's what's being illustrated in Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. So we ran the numbers, and basically it would take half of New England to produce as much wood as we need. 20 million acres out of 40 being managed with this sort of restrained ecological forestry would give us everything we need. Which is 60% of our forest, so that leaves a lot of room to think about. Do we want to expand agriculture a little bit? Do we want to have more wildlands? Is New England really a part of the country that should be exporting wood products? Some balance in an ideal world, all those choices would be open to us beyond at least meeting our own wood needs.
Which of those states has the greatest potentiality to produce lots and lots more high-quality timber?
All of them, but by two different routes. And that's the interesting thing. What we're doing with this proposal is basically saying that the current industrial forest should be managed in such a way that the trees get older. So you're investing in the trees as they grow rather than just cutting them off with a diameter limit cut and continually pulling them out when they're about 40 or 50 years old. Start thinning them, letting them grow up in the direction of ecological forestry by having them get nice and old. And all this stuff that's being undermanaged and hardly cut at all, but then when it is cut, too often high graded, when people just go in and cut the high value timber, do the sort of careful thinning we're talking about, pull the low grade out, and then gradually do this harvesting a little bit every year when the trees are in that 100, 120, 140-year-old range, so you're creating the small gaps and all that stuff.
What's the incentive for the industrial forestry?
Exactly. What we're asking these two different sets of forest owners to do is the exact opposite of what they want to do. These guys have a bottom line, and if you cut hard, you will serve your stakeholders, your shareholders the best, because time is money. So even the good management would give you more value in the long run, but they don't care about the long run. They care about the short run. And so it's more profitable to cut hard. So you would have to come up with some kind of incentive to convince them to do something else. And New England Forestry Foundation is or was, I'm not quite sure where they are now with their enormous grant, but the New England Forestry Foundation has been trying to work with some of the more responsible owners there to come up with ways of incentivizing them to cut on longer rotations and invest in things and all the rest of that. And a lot of the rest of us are going, are you crazy? They're not, they will just do it as long as the contract goes, and then they'll go right back to cutting hard again. And we need different owners.
Except for carbon. There are major concerns by many industrial producers of wood, because so much land is now being put into carbon sequestration.
Yeah, so it's
And
more
they're not
profit.
And they're not cutting any trees.
At all, right?
And so they're not getting anything off of the property.
Well, the workers aren't
So-
getting any work to do. The
Right.
company that owns it has got a contract that they have judged is more profitable for them for the next few decades by taking carbon credits.
Yeah.
And the concern of the rest of us is when that 30-year contract or whatever is over, there's nothing in that that says now you must leave that carbon on there.
Right.
So, yes, one thing you could do would be to incentivize folks to let the forest grow longer through some sort of ecological service payments, such as carbon credits. But
Because it's private, you couldn't legislate that in some manner.
I would love it if it were legislated in some manner, but that's quite a political tussle in a place like, say, Maine.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a major question is, how in the world would you actually incentivize that?
Well, then the second one is restoration. There's lots of money that could go into restoration, and that's where, on the worker side, rather
There's
than
something
having
to
you
do.
go out and you're clear cutting or doing large cutting,
Yeah.
openings of trees that you should probably be leaving.
Right.
You're going in to do what you're talking about, like thinnings or other things, or wildlife management, or bird habitat,
All
or et
that.
cetera. There's lots of restoration work that could be done.
There's-
It did work for a while in Washington, where a lot of the laid-off loggers were brought back in to do restoration work
Yeah,
on the
and that-
lands that they had nuked.
Yeah,
But they ran out of money, and it's sort of dried up.
Yeah, it's sort of dried up at the moment, and there's, out in Washington, my son's out in Washington now, and so there's fuel reduction work and prescribed burning, there's lots of things to be done, but then the issue is, who's gonna pay for it? How long will that payment last? And will the landowners stick with it if they're just doing it for bottom line considerations? So there's another school of thought on this, which is that our best bet long-term is to purchase that land and redistribute it to owners who really want to do this with it, like community forests, large wild reserves, and the tribes. But that would cost a lot of money. But to me, you need owners who have it in their hearts that they want to do this, and then we got to help them to do it. But that's a major problem. I mean, we talk about it in the booklet a little bit. We can figure out what would make great sense to do, how to do it. It's the same kind of problems as we address in industrial agriculture versus local sustainable agriculture. It cannot compete on the market. Ecological forestry costs more. It should cost more, because you're internalizing benefits instead of externalizing costs. And so somebody's got to pay for it. So meanwhile, how do we incentivize all these folks who own family forests to do that kind of work to actually get out there and do this sort of thing and all that stuff. And really the contention of my book is maybe that's where we've got the best chance to make some progress if we can make these sorts of connections to beautiful houses. Sort of like we do with organic food and local agriculture. We can at least start to build the market and the know how to do it with kind of a more affluent market, but then also work simultaneously to tie it to affordable housing in rural areas, et cetera, et cetera.
Do you find some pushback? So the European model is you've got a sort of village town center where all of the houses are, and then all the farms kind of go out. So that's a good use of your total agricable land.
Yeah.
Versus our model, which in the last 200 years has been, oh, pop a house over there, pop a house over there, and not very efficient, and a lot of transportation to get everywhere.
Low-density rural sprawl, which is now underway as people with lots of dough come out to live in rural areas. And yeah, that's what every land trust on the map, and we got hundreds of them in New England, is asking that same question: is how can we both protect land but also try to work to get more cluster development and the kind of development that we need? How do we make sure there's affordable workforce housing in rural areas, as well as these fancy new houses? And we're just working on a paper in Maine with Maine Local Woodworks and the Nature Conservancy and a group called Grow Smart Maine that looks at those issues in rural Maine about how land trusts can work together with community land trusts to identify housing sites and use some local wood in the construction of those houses.
What's your read on the state of the industry that could support ecological forestry? And one of the reasons I ask is that our big operation here, A. Johnson in Bristol,
just
out of business. There's been enough of a decline in the timber, the small scale timber industry to attract some media coverage. The workforce is aging out. Is this just a Vermont issue?
No.
How do we address that?
No.
Particularly in the part of that map that's the bottom half.
So it's gone here. I mean, it's almost gone. You saw the bits and pieces of it that are left just now in my slide presentation. But we lost most of those mills, medium-sized mills, long ago. And as you guys well know, I mean, I worked for a long time in the suburbs of Boston, in an affluent suburb called Weston, and we did some forestry there. I have sold like near quality oak saw logs from Weston, Massachusetts to Quebec. They get that called. So if you drive south on 91, you see all the trucks with oak on them going north. The capacity to rebuild the capacity to do this is a major issue. The same as in agriculture. We lost all our slaughterhouses. I mean, it's a big slog. And the question I ask myself is, can the kind of stuff that we did work great for us with the local band mills and so forth? If enough people did that, it would help to kind of regenerate the capacity to do more.
Yeah, you've really opened my eyes about that. It's an interesting analog to organic local agriculture, which we've all come to know and love. I've never really thought of it in terms of the
slow wood, slow food, slow wood. But of course, one of the problems with local organic agriculture, and Molly spent her whole career on this, is it's not serving more than a small slice of the population, and sort of this presents the same kind of problem. How do we both build it up, but try to make sure as we go along that it's serving more people in a just way?
And with agriculture, sorry, Mark, I just noticed you raising your hand. One of the barriers is lack of processing facilities like slaughterhouses. And it sounds like exactly the same thing is going on. We have 200 acres in Virginia that I am always trying to figure out what to do with that land. And there was a big slowdown with trying to get it thinned because nobody was working. The mills were shut down. So just like the federal government, at least pre-Trump, was investing in more processing infrastructure in slaughterhouses. I have no idea what's happening with that now, but I don't have good hopes. It seems like we need to do exactly the same thing with
And it's
forestry.
the same thing in fisheries. I mean, it's over and over again. And so what we're looking for in a book like this is just little ways we can keep it going and try to jumpstart it as administrations come and go, and we look to how we can mobilize more, larger scale federal support for something like this. Let me just say, just on a national scale, this is really viable. I mean, that's our national forest, that's the forest in the US, basically. And it's very close to where the population centers are, except for this, basically, But 20% or so of the US population is rural. So this kind of very direct model that I'm talking about is workable for that much of our need. The other 80% is urban and suburban, and it needs a regional, variation of what I've been talking about, and that variation is mass timber.
Mass timber?
Mass
Yeah,
timber,
mass
what-
timber.
meaning,
Mass timber meaning the cross-laminated panels
Okay.
and the glue-lam beams and all that kind of stuff with which you can build 20-story buildings.
yeah.
And you can use low-grade wood.
And you can use some low-grade wood, depending on how it's engineered. Sometimes you need fairly high grade for the outside too, of the 5 layers. But yeah, you can use hemlock and what have you. And they're using hardwoods in Europe.
So strategically, in terms of where we are with climate and local agriculture and forestry, I'm thinking very local, because certainly at the federal level and even here in Vermont at the state level, we're having to fight for the climate gains we've already made,
Yeah.
for the organic agriculture gains we've already made. So I love what you did with your house. I like what you're talking about. Are there local initiatives that could be fed in the interim until we get to more governments?
Yeah, I mean, I think this.
And what do those look like?
Well, the local ones are just more people who have if you have the means to build a house,
Mhm.
it's not going to cost you more or less to build in the way we did. It's going to cost about the same. It's going to be determined by the value of the land and the value of the size of the house and those kinds of things. So the most local thing is like that many more people who are building in rural areas build in this kind of way that they'll generate the demand.
I would gather there's a widespread belief that it will cost you.
I gather it would, because it's mostly associated with people who build, big cathedral ceilings and have the hammer beams and all. If you want to build a luxury timber frame house and have it in a nice magazine, you can do it. But basically, it's going to cost you about the same. If you want to build a real low-cost house and put in a lot of cheap equity and build it a timber frame, you can do that.
Okay.
But I would say, alongside local things, just zoning stuff so we can do more ADUs. I mean, have more possibilities to do the kind of building that needs to be done. And then at the state level, I mean, our state kind of climate planning and so forth is not dead. And there are some funds. A lot of what the state of Massachusetts does is recycling federal funds through state programs. So we are really whacked right now
Yeah.
at the land trust level. But just before I get to your question, Mark, those are different kind of forests. But yeah, that's an example. That's in New Haven, Connecticut, like a 4 or 5 story. It's on community-owned land, church land, and it's cross-laminated timber, mass timber construction. It's got 55 affordable units out of 69 or something in the whole building, and ground floor storefront kind of thing. And there's a lot of room for this sort of thing, and so that's the regional scale analog of our timber